Psalm 38 is about suffering and pain, but it is also about a choice we face when we suffer: resistance or acceptance. To resist, to fight and defend ourselves from our suffering, or to accept our suffering, trusting God and asking Him to defend and help us, even when the suffering is intense. And in Psalm 38, it is very intense. I have been groaning because of the severe suffering of my heart. My pain is always before me. In the Bible, people suffer for all kinds of different reasons. Sometimes the reason is not clear at all. But here, David knows the reason for his suffering. There is no sound spot in my flesh because of your anger. There is no well-being in my bones because of my sin. The suffering of this psalm is because of sin. The psalm does not tell us exactly what happened, what sin David committed that led to this suffering. But whatever it is, David is now crushed under the consequences of his sin. I have become weak and have been crushed completely. Everything is against him. Anything he could have depended on is gone, leaving him completely abandoned. His body is ruined, his strength has left him, his friends and companions stand far away, his enemies attack him, and he's left with absolutely nothing except the Lord. Abandoned by everything else, David cries out, "Do not abandon me, Lord. My God, do not be far from me. Hurry to help me, my Lord, my salvation." These words complete David's prayer, and they are also the fourth and final time that David directly addresses the Lord, using what we call vocatives. Interestingly, David seems to shape his prayer very intentionally around these four moments of directly addressing the Lord. These words are the fourth moment at the very end. The first is at the very beginning, in verse 2. "Lord, do not rebuke me when you're angry." Then in verse 10, "My Lord, everything I long for is before you." In verse 16, "But Lord, I have hoped for you. You yourself must answer, my Lord, my God." These four moments of addressing God show how the psalm has three parts: my suffering, my abandonment, my only hope, with one vocative at the beginning of the first part, one at the beginning of the second part, and then three at the beginning of the third part, which then closes with another four. And this pattern helps tell the story of the psalm, a story with a turning point in verse 16, where David seems to call on the Lord with much more intensity, a total of 7 times in the final 8 verses. But before we can get to that turning point, let's join David first in his suffering. "Lord, do not rebuke me when you're angry, or discipline me when you're wrathful." David confronts God with the intensity of his suffering, with the arrows God has shot into him, with no sound spot in my flesh and no well-being in my bones. My wounds have become foul with rot. I have become completely contorted, sides full of inflammation, and again, no sound spot in my flesh. David's body is at the point of ruin, such that he has become weak and crushed completely. And it's not only his pain that crushes him. The heavy burden, too heavy for him to handle, is his guilt, his iniquities which have gone over his head. Guilt and pain. And David is left groaning because of the severe suffering of his heart. Which brings us to the second direct address. "My Lord, everything I long for is before you, and my moaning is not hidden from you. My heart has been pounding. My strength has abandoned me." Here, David begins to confront the Lord with something even worse than his guilt and pain. Abandonment. My strength has abandoned me. David's suffering has become so intense that his body has given up on him. He's got nothing left, and even the light of his eyes, which is life itself, is no longer with him. But it gets worse. It's not only his body and his strength that have abandoned him. Those who love me, my companions, are standing far away from my injury, and my relatives have stood at a distance. His community has abandoned him. They stand far away at a distance. David suffers alone. And then it gets even worse. And those who seek to take my life have set a trap, and those who pursue my harm have been speaking of disaster, and they are constantly muttering treachery. His body and strength abandoned him, his friends abandoned him, now enemies threaten him, seeking to take his life. Everything is against him, and David has nothing left to defend himself. He is crushed. There is no way out, no last line of defense. He is completely vulnerable as his enemies close in. And at this point, David faces the choice: resistance or acceptance. Will David try to resist, to fight, to defend himself, to overcome? Or will he accept with resignation all his suffering? But I, like a deaf person, cannot hear, and I am like a mute person who cannot open his mouth. I have become like a man who does not hear and who has no arguments in his mouth. David chooses acceptance. He will not try to defend himself. He accepts that he cannot defend himself, like a deaf man who cannot hear and a mute man who cannot speak, with no arguments in his mouth. And that brings us to the turning point of verse 16. But, Lord, I have hoped for you. You yourself must answer, my Lord, my God. David's acceptance of his suffering does not lead to despair, but to trust. Trust in the only one left who can defend David. Acceptance and trust. And this choice of acceptance and trust is something we see again and again in the life of David. When God chose David to be king instead of Saul, and Saul tried to kill him, David did not fight back and defend himself. He accepted the suffering and trusted that God would defend him. Accept and trust. When David's son, Absalom, tried to kill David and become the new king instead of David, David did not fight back and defend himself. He accepted the suffering, left Jerusalem, and trusted that God would defend him. Accept and trust. Then on his way out of Jerusalem, a man called Shimei curses David and throws stones and dust at him, falsely accusing him and mocking him. And David's friend Avishai then says, "Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and cut off his head." Resistance, fighting back, defense. But David, leave him alone. Let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. Maybe the Lord will see my distress and repay me with good for the cursing I am receiving today. Accept and trust. You yourself must answer, my Lord, my God. From here, David then argues why God and God alone must answer and defend him. For I thought that they would rejoice concerning me, for I am certain to stumble, and my pain is always before me. David knows that he is certain to stumble. If he tries to defend himself, it won't succeed, and his enemies will rejoice, and they are mighty and numerous and hate him without cause. And all of this then comes together in the final fourth moment of directly addressing God, where David's decision of acceptance and trust back in verse 16 is now turned into a desperate plea for God to act. Do not abandon me, Lord. My God, do not be far from me. Hurry to help me, my Lord, my salvation. Accept and trust and ask. David does not just accept his suffering and trust in God to help him. He turns and asks, hurry to help me, my Lord, my salvation. And that is Psalm 38. My suffering, my abandonment, my only hope. David began in verses 2 to 9 confronting God with his suffering. There is no sound spot in my flesh, while acknowledging that my sin has caused my suffering. Then in verses 10 to 15, he confronts God with his abandonment. My strength and friends have abandoned me, and my enemies pursue my harm. Everything was against David, crushed and abandoned with his enemies closing in. And at this point, David chooses acceptance and resignation. I am unable to speak. I cannot defend myself. There are no arguments in my mouth. You, Lord, are my only hope. You, Lord, must answer. I cannot. I am distressed about what will happen because of my suffering and my sin and my enemies. Lord, do not abandon me now. Hurry to help me, my Lord, my salvation. And that is the story of Psalm 38. And the key turning point of this story, as we've seen, is here in verses 14 to 16. Under the weight of intense suffering, David chooses acceptance of his suffering and trust in God. As one poem describes it, I will accept the breaking sorrow, which God tomorrow will to his Son explain. Then did the turmoil deep within me cease. For vain the word, not vain, for in acceptance lieth peace.